Welcome to History Teller YT. In today's exploration, we embark on a profound journey into the heart of the Andean Mountains, where the echoes of ancient civilizations still resonate through the voices of today's indigenous youth. From the majestic heights of the Inca Empire to the modern-day struggles for land, culture, and rights, this history is both timeless and urgent. We'll delve into the stories of those who continue to fight for the preservation of their ancestral lands and traditions, while also pushing for justice, environmental sustainability, and self-determination in the face of modern challenges. As we uncover the struggles and triumphs of indigenous youth, you'll see how their efforts are shaping the future, not only for their communities, but for the world. So, sit back, immerse yourself in the powerful narrative of resilience, and discover how the legacies of the past are being carried forward today. By the end, you'll see how these young leaders are turning their histories into the blueprint for a better tomorrow. Before the Spanish arrived, the Inca Empire was the largest empire in the Americas, stretching from present-day southern Colombia to central Chile. The Incas were known for their highly organized and efficient administration, advanced agricultural techniques, and impressive architectural achievements, such as the construction of Machu Picchu. The empire was led by the Sapa Inca, considered the child of the sun god, Inti. The Incas believed their rulers had divine authority and were revered as living gods. The society was highly stratified, with the emperor at the top, followed by nobles, priests, and commoners. The Incas' expansionist policies allowed them to conquer and absorb numerous tribes and cultures. Their military prowess, combined with sophisticated road systems, allowed for rapid movement of troops and goods across vast distances. The Inca army was known for its discipline and use of advanced weaponry, though it was also unique in that it incorporated many conquered peoples into the military, allowing for a diverse and highly skilled force. At its height, the Inca Empire controlled a vast portion of western South America, but this expansion also sowed the seeds for future conflicts, as local tribes sometimes resented Inca rule and tribute demands. Atahualpa was the last reigning emperor of the Inca Empire, known for his intelligence and military acumen. He was the son of Huayna Capac, who had expanded the empire even further, but Atahualpa's reign began under tumultuous circumstances. After his father's death in 1527, the empire was split between his two sons, Atahualpa and Huascar. The civil war that followed between them weakened the empire and left it vulnerable to external threats. In 1532, Atahualpa emerged victorious, having defeated his brother Huascar and secured the throne. However, this victory came at a cost. The civil war had ravaged the empire's resources, and the Incas were still recovering from a deadly smallpox epidemic that had swept through their lands. Smallpox, introduced by the Spanish earlier, decimated the indigenous population before the Spanish even arrived, leaving behind a weakened and divided society. Despite this, Atahualpa was still a powerful and respected leader, capable of commanding great respect from his people. He was also shrewd, calculating, and not afraid to use force to maintain control over his subjects. In 1519, a small group of Spanish explorers, led by Hernán Cortés, had successfully overthrown the mighty Aztec Empire in present-day Mexico. This conquest set the stage for further Spanish exploration and expansion into the Americas. Francisco Pizarro, a former conquistador under Cortés, turned his attention southward to the riches of the Inca Empire. Pizarro had heard rumors of a vast and wealthy kingdom that could rival the Aztecs, and in 1526 he embarked on his first expedition to the Andes. The Spanish, however, faced significant challenges. Pizarro's first attempts to penetrate the Inca Empire were unsuccessful. Despite this, he was undeterred and returned in 1532, after learning of the Incas' internal divisions and weakened state. By this time, smallpox had further decimated the Inca population, and Atahualpa was dealing with the aftermath of his civil war with his brother. It was into this fragile state that Pizarro and his men would introduce their guns, horses, and the diseases that would eventually bring down the Inca Empire. The Spanish expedition, led by Francisco Pizarro, consisting of just around 180 men, marched into Inca territory in the year 1532. They had heard of the wealth of the Inca Empire and were determined to claim it for Spain. Pizarro's men were heavily outnumbered by the Inca forces, with estimates suggesting that Atahualpa's army numbered in the tens of thousands. However, the Spanish had the advantage of advanced weaponry, horses, and military tactics, all of which were completely unfamiliar to the Incas. The pivotal moment came at Cajamarca, a town located in the northern highlands of the Inca Empire. Atahualpa, unaware of the Spanish threat, agreed to meet with Pizarro in person. The meeting was set up under the pretense of peaceful negotiations, but Pizarro had other plans. As Atahualpa entered the town with only a small retinue of unarmed attendants, Pizarro's forces ambushed the Inca Emperor and his guard. The Spanish soldiers opened fire with their firearms and launched a surprise attack, catching the Inca forces completely off guard. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Spanish utilized their superior tactics, firearms, and armor, and the ambush was devastating. Atahualpa, shocked by the sudden violence, was taken prisoner. His guards, though numerous, were unable to resist the firepower of the Spanish. The emperor was captured and held hostage, marking a turning point in the history of the Inca Empire. Pizarro, despite being outnumbered, had outwitted the Inca leader through a combination of surprise, military superiority, and the element of deception. After capturing Atahualpa, Pizarro demanded a ransom, believing that the Inca emperor's wealth would be enough to secure his release. Atahualpa offered a vast fortune, agreeing to fill a room with gold and silver as payment for his freedom. The room was to be filled to a height of around 22 feet, and the total amount of gold and silver to be collected from all over the empire was to be immense. The Inca people, fearful of the wrath of their emperor's captors, scrambled to provide the enormous ransom demanded by the Spanish. The people of the empire, including those who had previously been enemies of Atahualpa, complied with the ransom demand. The treasures were collected from across the Inca Empire: golden ornaments, jewelry, and precious metals. It was a staggering amount of wealth that would later be estimated to be worth millions of dollars by modern standards. However, despite the enormous wealth that was delivered to the Spanish, Pizarro's men did not honor their word. Atahualpa, although he had given his wealth in exchange for freedom, was ultimately betrayed. Atahualpa's ransom did not save him. In a cruel twist, Pizarro and his men had already decided that the emperor was a threat to their conquest and could not be allowed to live. On August 29, 1533, Atahualpa was executed by strangulation, despite having fulfilled his side of the bargain. His death was a devastating blow to the Inca Empire, symbolizing the beginning of its rapid collapse. Without their emperor, the Incas were left disoriented and leaderless, and the Spanish, having secured the wealth of the empire, pressed forward with their conquest. The death of Atahualpa marked the end of an era for the Inca Empire, but it was not the end of the conflict. The empire, despite being decimated by the loss of its emperor and the brutal conquest of its heartland, did not fall easily. The Spanish, though victorious at Cajamarca, faced resistance from the remaining forces of the Inca. Atahualpa's death did not result in the immediate collapse of the Inca political structure, and a power vacuum remained in the aftermath of his execution. The Incas, led by various regional leaders, began to resist the Spanish invaders. Manco Inca, the brother of Atahualpa, was initially installed by the Spanish as a puppet ruler, but he quickly rebelled against the conquerors. His resistance sparked a series of skirmishes and a more organized campaign to rid the Inca heartland of Spanish influence. While the Spanish had won the major battle at Cajamarca, they were far from in control of the entire empire. As Pizarro continued to press forward, the Spanish faced significant challenges, including a lack of supplies and the growing Inca resistance. Manco Inca's rebellion, though initially unsuccessful, led to a series of prolonged conflicts. The Incas waged guerrilla warfare, utilizing their deep knowledge of the mountainous terrain to fight back against the Spanish invaders. The conflict culminated in the siege of Sacsayhuaman, an ancient Inca fortress that would be a pivotal moment in the resistance against the Spanish. The fortress, located near the Inca capital of Cusco, was a symbol of Inca power and strength, and its fall marked the near collapse of the Inca resistance. The Inca Empire, once a dominant force in South America, was now on the brink of extinction. After Atahualpa's execution, the Incas were left in turmoil. Although Pizarro had won a decisive victory at Cajamarca, his control over the vast Inca territory remained tenuous. The Spanish had no intention of fully consolidating power yet, and they sought to take advantage of the confusion within the Inca ranks. To solidify Spanish rule, Pizarro installed Manco Inca, the brother of Atahualpa, as a puppet ruler in Cusco. Manco, who was supposed to work in the Spanish interest, initially went along with the arrangement, but his loyalty quickly shifted as he grew increasingly disillusioned by Spanish brutality. Manco Inca soon realized that the Spanish were not only seeking wealth and power, but were also determined to eradicate Inca culture and replace it with Christianity. As a result, he decided to rebel against the Spanish occupiers. By 1536, he had gathered a sizable force of Inca soldiers, including warriors from the highland and lowland regions who resented Spanish rule. Manco launched his rebellion with the aim of liberating Cusco and restoring the Inca Empire to its former glory. The first significant confrontation between Manco's forces and the Spanish occurred when Manco laid siege to the Spanish stronghold in the Inca capital, Cusco. The siege of Sacsayhuaman, an Inca fortress located just outside Cusco, would become the focal point of the conflict. The fortress, which had been built with massive stone blocks that fit together so precisely that no mortar was used, was one of the greatest architectural feats of the Inca Empire. It was here that Manco sought to encircle and defeat the Spanish forces that had taken refuge in the city. The siege was one of the most intense moments of resistance in the entire Spanish conquest of the Americas. Manco's forces surrounded the fortress, cutting off supply lines and inflicting heavy casualties on the Spanish defenders. However, despite the fierce resistance, the Spanish managed to withstand the siege. The arrival of reinforcements, combined with their superior weaponry and tactics, allowed the Spanish to break the siege and force Manco's forces to retreat. Despite the initial success of Manco's rebellion, the Incas were ultimately unable to overcome the Spanish forces. The Spanish, though initially outnumbered and besieged, had several advantages that allowed them to remain in control. One of the most significant factors was their advanced weaponry, including firearms and steel swords, which gave them a deadly edge in battle. Additionally, the Spanish were able to use the element of surprise and superior tactics to counter the Inca forces, especially in smaller skirmishes. The Spanish also had the advantage of their horses, which were a powerful and terrifying weapon to the Incas. The Inca soldiers had never seen horses before, and their inability to effectively combat mounted cavalry was a decisive factor in many of the battles. While the Incas possessed superior numbers, they lacked the firepower and experience to mount a successful defense against the Spanish. Furthermore, the Incas were divided. with some factions continuing to resist while others sought peace with the Spanish in exchange for protection or political power. By 1537, the Spanish had effectively crushed the most significant resistance to their rule. Manco Inca, realizing that his rebellion was faltering, fled into the mountains, continuing to lead sporadic guerrilla attacks against Spanish outposts. However, his ability to rally widespread support was diminished, and the Incas' resistance began to weaken. The Spanish forces, led by Pizarro's brothers and other key conquistadors, continued their expansion into the heartland of the Inca Empire, eventually taking control of the remaining Inca territories. In 1537, after Manco's retreat, the Spanish regrouped and began to reassert their control over Cusco. The remaining Incas had no choice but to surrender or flee into the mountains, where their traditional way of life would be forever altered. The loss of Cusco, the Inca capital, symbolized the final collapse of the Inca Empire as a political entity. The Spanish turned the former heart of the empire into a colonial city, beginning the process of colonization that would last for centuries. Despite the fall of Cusco, the Incas continued to hold out in the remote region of Vilcabamba, located in the highlands of modern-day Peru. This region, known for its difficult terrain, became the last stronghold of the Inca resistance. Manco Inca, along with his followers, retreated to Vilcabamba, where he established a new Inca capital and continued to lead a small but determined guerrilla campaign against the Spanish. The Spanish, however, were relentless in their pursuit of the remaining Inca leaders. In 1539, Pizarro sent a military expedition led by his brother, Gonzalo Pizarro, to track down and eliminate the remaining Inca forces. The expedition ventured into the difficult terrain of Vilcabamba and, after a series of skirmishes, captured Manco Inca's new capital. Manco himself, along with several of his followers, managed to escape once again, but his position was weakening. The Spanish had closed in on the final remnants of the Inca resistance, and their military dominance was becoming undeniable. By 1541, Manco Inca was betrayed by one of his own followers, and he was captured by the Spanish. After his capture, Manco was paraded through the streets and brought before the Spanish authorities. He was forced to renounce his claims as Emperor of the Incas and was kept under close guard by the Spanish. His capture marked the end of any significant organized resistance to Spanish rule. Although the Incas would continue to resist in smaller, isolated groups, the empire was effectively no longer a political force. Manco Inca was later executed in 1544. This marked the final death knell for the once great Inca Empire, which had fallen after a mere 30 years of Spanish occupation. The Spanish, having now completely eradicated any significant threat from the Incas, turned their attention to exploiting the rich resources of the empire, particularly the vast gold and silver deposits. The once mighty civilization had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former self, and the Incas, who had ruled over a vast empire, were now subjects of the Spanish crown. The fall of the Inca Empire was a devastating blow to one of the most advanced civilizations in the Americas. Once the Spanish had secured control over Cusco and the surrounding territories, they began the process of consolidating their power across the former Inca domains. The Spanish implemented a system known as the encomienda, which granted Spanish settlers and soldiers the right to extract forced labor and tribute from the indigenous population. The encomienda system was essentially a form of slavery, under which the Incas were forced to work in mines, farms, and on Spanish-owned estates, often under brutal conditions. The Inca society, which had once been a highly organized and advanced civilization with a complex system of agriculture, architecture, and governance, was decimated by Spanish rule. While many aspects of Inca culture, such as the worship of the sun god and traditional practices, persisted in remote regions. The Spanish imposed their own culture, religion, and governance structures upon the conquered population. The Catholic Church played a significant role in this process, actively converting the Inca people to Christianity, often with forceful methods. The conversion of the indigenous population was part of a broader Spanish imperial agenda to civilize and dominate the Americas, imposing European norms on the native cultures. While the Spanish presence was primarily focused on the exploitation of the region's vast resources, the cultural legacy of the Incas remained in some ways. The Spanish colonial administration, though overwhelmingly exploitative, did preserve certain elements of Inca infrastructure. For example, the vast network of roads and bridges built by the Incas was adapted and incorporated into the Spanish colonial infrastructure, enabling easier movement across the Andean highlands. Additionally, some of the Inca architectural styles, particularly their use of stone masonry, influenced Spanish construction practices in the region. The exploitation of the Incas' gold and silver resources was one of the primary goals of Spanish colonial rule. Large-scale mining operations, particularly in the region of Potosí, modern-day Bolivia, were established to extract precious metals. The silver mines in Potosí became some of the richest in the world, and the wealth extracted from these mines helped to fuel the Spanish Empire's expansion in Europe and beyond. However, the exploitation of indigenous labor in these mines was catastrophic. Thousands of Incas and other indigenous people died from the harsh working conditions, and the social fabric of the Andean societies was forever altered. Despite the devastating impact of Spanish colonization on the Inca Empire, the legacy of the Incas lived on in the cultures of the Andean region. Even though the Spanish imposed their own governance, religion, and culture, the indigenous population retained many aspects of their Inca heritage. Many elements of Inca society were preserved, particularly in the highland villages where the Andean peoples maintained traditional agricultural practices, dress, and language. The Inca language, Quechua, continued to be spoken by millions of people in the Andean region. Quechua was the official language of the Inca Empire, and even after the Spanish conquest, it remained the primary language of communication for the indigenous population. The preservation of Quechua and other indigenous languages in the face of Spanish colonization is a testament to the resilience of Inca culture. Although the Spanish attempted to suppress indigenous languages, the legacy of the Inca people persisted in the daily lives of the Andean peoples. In addition to language, Inca traditions in agriculture, textiles, and pottery continued to influence the way of life in the Andes. The terrace farming techniques developed by the Incas, which allowed them to grow crops at high altitudes, remained in use for centuries. In fact, the Incas' agricultural practices played a crucial role in sustaining the population in the harsh Andean environment, and they were adapted and passed down through generations of indigenous farmers. Similarly, Inca weaving and textile arts, known for their intricate designs and use of vibrant colors, continued to thrive in many Andean communities. Despite the overwhelming power of the Spanish, there were pockets of resistance that endured in the highlands and remote areas. Over time, these areas became centers of indigenous culture and identity, and the memory of the Inca Empire was kept alive through oral traditions and resistance movements. This cultural resilience would play a role in later struggles for independence from Spanish rule. The Spanish Empire, which had once dominated vast territories across the Americas, began to decline in the early 19th century. The legacy of Spanish colonialism and the exploitation of indigenous populations left deep scars on the societies of Latin America, but it also fueled the desire for independence. Across the continent, from Mexico to the Southern Cone, colonial subjects rose up against Spanish rule. These movements were inspired by the ideas of liberty and equality that were sweeping across Europe and the Americas, particularly the French and American revolutions. In the Andean region, where the Inca Empire had once flourished, resistance to Spanish colonial rule was particularly intense. The legacy of Inca resistance, combined with the socio-economic injustices imposed by the Spanish, created a fertile ground for revolutionary movements. Leaders such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín emerged as the faces of the independence movement in South America. Bolívar's vision of a united Latin America led to a series of military campaigns against Spanish forces in the Andean region. The Wars of Independence, which stretched from 1810 to 1824, involved not only Creoles and Mestizos, but also indigenous people who saw in the struggle a chance to reclaim their lost freedom. The independence movement in Peru, where the Inca Empire had once reigned supreme, culminated in the decisive Battle of Ayacucho in 1824, where Spanish forces were defeated, effectively ending Spanish colonial rule in South America. The collapse of the Spanish Empire in the Americas brought an end to the centuries-long domination of European powers over the Andean peoples and the territories once ruled by the Incas. However, the process of rebuilding and establishing new nations was long and difficult. The new republics of Latin America faced significant challenges, including economic instability, political fragmentation, and ongoing struggles with indigenous populations that had suffered under both colonial and post-colonial regimes. Despite these challenges, the legacy of the Inca Empire and the desire for self-determination continued to shape the region's identity for generations. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire had profound and lasting effects on the indigenous cultures of the Andes, reshaping the way of life for the native peoples in the region. The destruction of the Inca political system, the loss of their emperor, and the introduction of new Spanish systems of governance, religion, and social structure marked the beginning of a new era of colonial rule. For the indigenous people, this era was characterized by exploitation, forced labor, and the imposition of foreign cultural norms. One of the most significant cultural shifts introduced by the Spanish was the imposition of Catholicism. The Inca religion, which centered around the worship of the sun god, Inti, and a complex pantheon of deities tied to nature and the cosmos, was replaced by the Catholic faith. Spanish missionaries, both priests and settlers, sought to convert the indigenous population through a combination of persuasion and coercion. Churches were built over Inca temples, and indigenous religious practices were either banned or forced underground. Despite these efforts, many aspects of Inca spiritual practices persisted, often blending with Catholicism in a syncretic form of belief. This fusion of cultures is most evident in the religious festivals and practices that continue to be observed in the Andes today. Many indigenous communities celebrate Catholic saints' days alongside traditional festivals, blending elements of Catholic and Inca religious traditions. This cultural syncretism highlights the resilience of Inca culture, which managed to survive despite the traumatic imposition of foreign religious practices. The Spanish also sought to reshape the social and political structure of the Andes. They introduced the repartimiento system, which was a form of labor draft that replaced the Incas' MITA system of communal labor. While the MITA system had been used by the Incas to mobilize labor for public works projects, the Spanish adapted this system to exploit indigenous labor for mining and agriculture, often in brutal conditions. The mines of Potosí, in modern-day Bolivia, became infamous for the vast amounts of silver extracted from them, much of it through the forced labor of indigenous people. These exploitative systems were a central aspect of Spanish colonialism, leaving deep scars in the social fabric of Andean societies. Despite the cultural upheaval and exploitation brought by the Spanish conquest, some aspects of Inca civilization endured, especially in terms of architecture and infrastructure. The Incas had developed one of the most sophisticated systems of roads, bridges, and administrative centers in the pre-Columbian Americas. Their achievements in stonework, particularly in the construction of temples, fortresses, and agricultural terraces, remained impressive and enduring symbols of their once great empire. The Spanish, while eager to extract wealth from the region, also recognized the value of Inca infrastructure. The Inca road system, which spanned over 25,000 miles and connected the empire's far-flung territories, proved invaluable to the Spanish for administering their newly conquered territories. Spanish colonial administrators adapted the existing Inca roads for use in the colonial economy, facilitating the movement of goods, military forces, and settlers. Some Inca-built roads remain in use to this day, particularly in the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, where the landscape is still shaped by Inca engineering. Similarly, the Inca practice of terrace farming, which enabled the cultivation of crops in the steep Andean mountains, continued to influence agricultural practices in the region. The Spanish did not dismantle these terraces, as they were an essential part of the local agricultural system. Instead, they adapted and improved upon them, integrating them into the colonial economy. The agricultural knowledge passed down from the Incas, particularly in the cultivation of potatoes, maize, and quinoa, continues to shape the diets of Andean people and remains a critical aspect of Andean agriculture. In terms of architecture, the Spanish took full advantage of Inca stonework, particularly in the construction of churches and colonial buildings. Some of the most famous Spanish colonial buildings, such as the Cathedral of Cusco, were built on the foundations of Inca structures. The walls of these buildings incorporated Inca stonework, known for its precision and durability. This fusion of Spanish and Inca architectural styles is an enduring symbol of the blending of two worlds, a testament to the cultural and physical imprints left by both civilizations. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire set the stage for centuries of colonial rule in South America, the effects of which continue to resonate in the modern socio-political and economic landscape of the Andes. The legacy of Spanish colonialism is still evident in the structure of modern South American countries, particularly in their economic systems, social hierarchies, and political institutions. One of the most significant aspects of the colonial legacy is the system of land tenure established by the Spanish. Through the encomienda and repartimiento systems, Spanish settlers gained control over vast tracts of land and the labor of the indigenous population. This created an economic structure that was highly dependent on the extraction of resources, primarily minerals and agriculture, often through forced labor. The wealth that flowed from silver and gold mining, particularly in regions such as Potosí and Cajamarca, fueled the Spanish Empire and contributed to the rise of global capitalism. However, the economic benefits of this system were not shared equally. The indigenous population was subjugated to harsh labor conditions, leading to significant social inequality. The vast majority of the indigenous population remained impoverished and disenfranchised, while a small group of Spanish settlers and their descendants, known as Creoles, held most of the wealth and power. This socioeconomic divide contributed to the political instability that would later fuel the independence movements across South America in the early 19th century. The racial hierarchy established by the Spanish colonial system also had lasting effects. The caste system in Spanish colonial rule placed Spaniards at the top, followed by mixed-race mestizos, and with indigenous peoples and Africans at the bottom. This social stratification laid the groundwork for racial discrimination, which persisted well into the 20th century and continues to affect many indigenous communities in South America today. The exploitation of indigenous labor in the mines, agricultural fields, and urban centers led to a demographic crisis. The indigenous population, which had been severely decimated by war, disease, and forced labor, faced further declines during the colonial period. It is estimated that the native population of the Andes region fell by as much as 90% during the first century of Spanish rule, due in large part to diseases like smallpox, along with the brutal conditions in the mines. The legacy of Spanish colonialism left deep scars on the social, economic, and political systems of South America. However, the enduring resistance of indigenous people, coupled with a growing desire for freedom among the colonial elites, eventually led to the independence movements of the early 19th century. The causes of these movements were complex, rooted in the economic exploitation, racial divisions, and the increasing influence of Enlightenment ideals from Europe and the United States. The French and American revolutions served as powerful inspirations as the concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity found their way to the Spanish colonies. In the Andes, the struggle for independence was especially bitter. The Andean region had been one of the most heavily exploited by the Spanish, with vast silver mines in places like Potosí and Cajamarca feeding the Spanish Empire's coffers. The native population, decimated by disease, forced labor, and social stratification, found themselves at the bottom of the social hierarchy, with little hope for upward mobility. Over time, the dissatisfaction among the oppressed indigenous population, as well as the Creole elites who were excluded from political power, led to the rise of revolutionary movements. Independence movements in the Andean region were led by figures such as Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Antonio José de Sucre, who sought to free the Spanish colonies from their colonial rulers. Bolívar, known as El Libertador, was instrumental in leading the revolutionary forces in northern South America, particularly in present-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. In the south, José de San Martín led the fight against the Spanish in Chile and Argentina, eventually joining forces with Bolívar to secure the independence of Peru. The battles for independence were long and bloody, marked by fierce fighting between the Spanish loyalists and the growing forces of independence. The wars of independence in the Andes were not just military struggles. They were also cultural and ideological battles, with indigenous peoples and mestizos seeking to reclaim their rights and identities after centuries of colonial oppression. The indigenous population played a crucial role in the wars of independence, fighting alongside the revolutionary armies, often motivated by the promise of greater autonomy and freedom. In Peru, the final victory came in 1824 with the Battle of Ayacucho, a decisive confrontation that resulted in the defeat of the Spanish forces. This battle marked the end of Spanish rule in the Andes and secured the independence of Peru. The victory was not only a military one, but also a symbolic one, representing the end of centuries of Spanish domination and the beginning of a new era for the Andean region. However, the process of nation-building would prove to be challenging, as the region faced political instability, economic difficulties, and unresolved tensions between the different ethnic and social groups. The struggle for independence in the Andes was undoubtedly a significant chapter in the region's history, but the indigenous people's quest for equality and justice did not end with the liberation from Spanish rule. After independence, the newly formed republics of South America continued to be shaped by colonial legacies, and indigenous populations remained marginalized and oppressed. Despite their crucial role in the wars of independence, indigenous peoples were often excluded from the political process in the newly established nations. In Peru, the post-independence period saw the rise of caudillos, military strongmen, and political elites, many of whom were Creoles or mestizos, who maintained the social hierarchies established during the colonial period. The promises of greater equality made during the independence movements were largely unfulfilled, as indigenous peoples continued to face discrimination and economic exploitation. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, indigenous communities in the Andes faced continued land dispossession, forced labor, and cultural suppression. While the Spanish were no longer in power, the economic and social systems they had established continued to dominate. Indigenous people were often relegated to the outskirts of society, living in poverty and denied basic political and civil rights. This situation led to the formation of various indigenous movements throughout the region, seeking recognition of their rights and the restoration of their land. One of the most important indigenous movements in modern Peru was the Andean Indigenous Rights Movement, which began to gain momentum in the late 20th century. This movement sought to address the historical injustices faced by indigenous peoples, particularly regarding land rights, education, and political representation. The struggle for land reform was especially significant as large tracts of land that had once been held by indigenous communities were taken by the state and private landowners during and after colonial times. Land redistribution became a key issue in the fight for indigenous rights. In the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of indigenous organizations, such as Kanakami, National Confederation of Peasant, Agricultural, and Native Communities of Peru, and the growing influence of indigenous political leaders brought attention to the plight of the indigenous population. These movements sought greater political representation, cultural recognition, and social justice. They also pushed for the recognition of indigenous languages and customs in the national identity of Peru, advocating for a multicultural society that acknowledged the diverse heritage of the country. Despite facing resistance from political elites and powerful economic interests, these movements began to gain traction in the late 20th century, leading to some significant political changes. In 1993, the Peruvian Constitution was amended to recognize the country as a multi-ethnic nation, acknowledging the rights of indigenous peoples. However, much work remains to be done, as indigenous communities continue to face challenges in securing land rights, access to education, and protection from exploitation. Despite centuries of colonization, the cultural resilience of the Inca people and their descendants has been one of the most striking features of the Andean region. While the Spanish sought to eradicate indigenous traditions and impose their own culture, many elements of Inca heritage survived, albeit in transformed forms. The survival of Inca cultural practices, language, and traditions is a testament to the strength and resilience of the Andean people. One of the most significant aspects of this cultural survival is the continued use of the Quechua language, which was the official language of the Inca Empire. Today, Quechua is spoken by millions of people across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and other Andean countries. It is recognized as one of the most widely spoken indigenous languages in the Americas. Efforts to preserve and revitalize Quechua have gained momentum in recent decades, with various organizations and governments promoting its use in education, media, and public life. The resurgence of interest in Quechua has helped strengthen indigenous identity in the region, providing a cultural link to the Inca past. In the realm of art and culture, the influence of Inca traditions can be seen in the textiles, pottery, and agricultural practices of Andean communities. Inca weaving techniques, renowned for their intricate patterns and vibrant colors, have been preserved and passed down through generations. Many indigenous communities continue to create textiles using traditional methods, which are highly valued in the markets of Cusco and other Andean cities. These textiles often depict scenes from Inca mythology, agricultural life, and local landscapes, preserving a visual connection to the past. In addition to textiles, the Andean people continue to honor the Inca connection to the land through agricultural practices. The terraces constructed by the Incas for growing crops in the harsh Andean environment are still in use today. These terraces, which allow farmers to cultivate crops at high altitudes, are a key part of the Andean agricultural heritage. The Incas' sophisticated knowledge of irrigation, crop rotation, and soil management has influenced modern farming techniques in the region. In the 21st century, indigenous peoples in the Andes continue to struggle for land, rights, and recognition, but their efforts are slowly reshaping the political and social landscape of the region. The historical legacy of colonial land dispossession, coupled with the dominance of large agricultural estates and mining operations, continues to affect indigenous communities. However, these communities have increasingly asserted their rights, demanding land restitution, cultural recognition, and political representation. The process of land reclamation began in earnest with the formation of indigenous organizations that sought to challenge the legacy of dispossession. In Peru, for example, the National Confederation of Peruvian Communities, CONACAMI, and other grassroots movements have played a pivotal role in advocating for the rights of indigenous populations. These organizations have sought to ensure that the voices of indigenous communities are heard in national politics, particularly on issues such as land rights, environmental protection, and social justice. One of the most significant developments in the fight for indigenous land rights in recent decades has been the legal recognition of indigenous territories. In 1993, the Peruvian Constitution was amended to declare Peru a multi-ethnic nation, recognizing the existence of indigenous peoples and their rights. This legal recognition was further bolstered by international agreements, such as International Labor Organization Convention No. 169, which mandates the protection of indigenous rights, particularly with regard to land and natural resources. Despite these advancements, the struggle for land and rights is ongoing. Many indigenous communities continue to face resistance from powerful economic interests, particularly those involved in extractive industries such as mining and oil. In areas like the Amazon rainforest and the Andean highlands, indigenous peoples have fought battles against the expansion of mining operations that threaten their land, water sources, and way of life. These industries have often been prioritized over indigenous rights, with the Peruvian government and multinational corporations clashing with local communities who demand their land and resources be respected. One such example is the ongoing conflict in Cajamarca, a region rich in gold deposits. In the 1990s and early 2000s, large-scale mining operations were set up, displacing indigenous communities and polluting the environment. In response, local communities organized protests and resistance movements to challenge the environmental destruction caused by mining. Although the protests were met with violence and repression by the government, they highlighted the enduring tension between economic development and indigenous land rights. Indigenous activists have fought not only for land restitution, but for the recognition of the environmental knowledge and sustainable practices that have allowed them to thrive in the Andean landscape for centuries. The fight for land rights and social justice continues to be a central issue for indigenous peoples in Peru and across the Andean region. However, the increased recognition of indigenous voices, combined with national and international support, has provided these communities with new tools to challenge the legacy of colonialism and assert their rights. As the global community increasingly focuses on indigenous rights, environmental protection, and sustainable development, the struggles of the Andean indigenous populations are gaining international attention, paving the way for future victories. In recent decades, indigenous identity has become a central issue in the politics and culture of the Andean nations, particularly in Peru. The long history of discrimination, marginalization, and cultural suppression experienced by indigenous peoples during both colonial and post-colonial periods has led to a reawakening of indigenous pride and activism. Indigenous peoples have begun to assert their identity not only as a form of resistance, but also as a path toward cultural rejuvenation and social equality. The recognition of indigenous rights and identity has become an important part of the political discourse in countries like Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia, where indigenous populations have historically been excluded from political power. In Peru, the election of Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2006 marked a historic moment for indigenous politics in the region. Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, represented a turning point for the indigenous rights movement across South America. His presidency emphasized the importance of recognizing indigenous culture, languages, and rights within a national framework. In Peru, indigenous organizations and activists have also played an important role in shaping the national conversation about indigenous identity. These movements have focused not only on land rights and political representation, but also on the recognition of indigenous languages and cultural practices. One notable achievement has been the growing acceptance of Quechua and other indigenous languages in public life, including education and media. Efforts to preserve and revitalize indigenous languages have been critical in fostering a sense of cultural continuity and pride among younger generations, many of whom have been disconnected from their indigenous heritage. Beyond language, indigenous communities have also worked to assert their cultural practices and traditions as valuable contributions to the national identity. Andean festivals, which often blend Catholic and indigenous beliefs, have gained prominence in national celebrations, and the arts and crafts of indigenous communities have been recognized for their cultural significance. For example, Andean textiles, which are deeply rooted in Inca traditions, are now celebrated as national treasures, with their intricate designs and vibrant colors representing the resilience of indigenous culture. Moreover, the role of indigenous women in this cultural revitalization has become increasingly important. Indigenous women, who have historically been marginalized even within their own communities, have emerged as leaders in the fight for cultural preservation and social justice. Women in Andean communities are playing a central role in the political, economic, and cultural revitalization of their people. From advocating for education and healthcare to leading environmental and land rights campaigns, indigenous women are at the forefront of efforts to reclaim their ancestral heritage and assert their place in modern society. While the indigenous peoples of the Andes have made significant strides in reclaiming their land, rights, and cultural identity, the struggle for decolonization remains an ongoing process. Decolonization is not only about the physical reclaiming of land, but also about dismantling the lingering systems of colonial oppression that continue to affect indigenous communities today. In many ways, the ongoing challenges faced by indigenous populations in South America reflect the broader global struggle for decolonization and justice. The concept of decolonization is deeply tied to the recognition of indigenous sovereignty, the protection of indigenous lands and resources, and the reclamation of indigenous knowledge systems. For many indigenous leaders, decolonization is a long-term process that involves not just the reversal of colonial policies, but the reimagining of social, economic, and political systems that have been dominated by colonial powers for centuries. This vision of decolonization includes the recognition of indigenous self-governance, the revitalization of indigenous cultures and languages, and the creation of economic systems that prioritize indigenous knowledge and sustainability. In Peru and other Andean countries, indigenous communities are continuing to demand a larger voice in national politics and the international arena. They are calling for policies that prioritize environmental conservation, sustainable development, and the protection of their cultural heritage. Additionally, indigenous leaders are working to combat the lasting impacts of colonialism, including the persistence of racial inequality and economic exploitation in modern societies. As the global community increasingly recognizes the importance of environmental sustainability and human rights, the indigenous struggles in the Andes are gaining broader support. The protection of indigenous lands, particularly in regions like the Amazon and the Andes, has become a key issue in international debates about climate change, biodiversity, and environmental conservation. Indigenous knowledge of land management, agriculture, and ecology is being recognized as essential to the protection of the environment, and many indigenous leaders are now at the forefront of global environmental movements. While the path toward true decolonization is still long and fraught with challenges, the struggles of the Andean indigenous peoples remain a testament to the resilience of cultures that have survived centuries of oppression. The future of indigenous communities in the Andes will be shaped by their ability to navigate the complexities of modernity while preserving the rich cultural heritage of the Inca Empire and other pre-Columbian civilizations. The struggles of indigenous peoples in the Andes, particularly in countries like Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia, have increasingly been recognized on the global stage, especially as issues of human rights, environmental conservation, and cultural preservation gain more attention. Indigenous communities, long marginalized and oppressed, have become central players in discussions about the future of the environment, land rights, and social justice. The global recognition of indigenous rights has been influenced by a variety of international frameworks, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, which was adopted in 2007 and outlines the rights of indigenous peoples to self-determination, land, culture, and traditional knowledge. This declaration represents a significant step in the global acknowledgement of indigenous rights, particularly in the context of historical injustices committed against native populations during colonization and in its aftermath. The principles enshrined in UNDRIP have become a key tool for indigenous movements around the world to assert their rights and challenge the systemic exploitation and marginalization they have faced for centuries. For instance, indigenous leaders in the Andes have used UNDRIP to advocate for land restitution, the preservation of their cultural practices, and the protection of their natural resources, particularly in the face of extractive industries like mining and oil drilling. In addition to UNDRIP, international human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have increasingly focused their efforts on defending the rights of indigenous communities. These organizations have documented the ongoing abuses faced by indigenous peoples, particularly those living in resource-rich areas, where corporate interests and government policies often prioritize extraction over indigenous rights. Through campaigns, lobbying, and legal battles, these groups have sought to bring global attention to the environmental destruction caused by industries operating on indigenous land and the social and economic injustices that indigenous people continue to face. The role of indigenous communities in environmental conservation is another area where their global recognition has been transformative. Indigenous peoples, especially those in the Amazon and Andean regions, have long managed their environments using sustainable agricultural practices, forestry, and traditional ecological knowledge. In the context of global climate change, these knowledge systems are now increasingly seen as vital to the preservation of biodiversity and the fight against deforestation. Indigenous land stewardship practices are being incorporated into global discussions on conservation and climate mitigation, and indigenous leaders are being invited to international forums, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. However, despite these advancements in global recognition, the gap between international frameworks and the lived realities of indigenous communities in the Andes remains wide. Governments and multinational corporations often fail to fully implement the promises of international declarations, leading to continued conflict and resistance. Indigenous peoples still face significant challenges when asserting their rights in the face of powerful economic interests. The ongoing struggle for land, political representation, and the protection of cultural heritage continues to be a defining feature of the indigenous movement in South America. One of the most powerful manifestations of the global recognition of indigenous rights has been the growing role of indigenous peoples in environmental advocacy, particularly in the Andes. The mountainous region of the Andes, which was once the heartland of the Inca Empire, is home to some of the world's most biodiverse ecosystems and is also rich in natural resources such as gold, silver, and natural gas. As global demand for these resources has increased, indigenous communities living in the Andes have found themselves at the front lines of environmental conflicts, fighting to protect their lands from large-scale extraction projects. The indigenous resistance against extractive industries is deeply rooted in the desire to protect the environment and maintain traditional ways of life. For many indigenous communities in the Andes, the land is not just a source of livelihood, but also a sacred and ancestral home. The environmental degradation caused by mining, oil drilling, and logging has disrupted ecosystems, polluted water sources, and displaced entire communities. In Peru, the fight against oil drilling in the Amazon rainforest and the construction of large mining projects in the Andes has been a significant focus for indigenous activists. One of the most notable examples of indigenous environmental resistance is the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of the Ecuadorian Amazon, CONE, which has been a key player in advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples and the environment. CONE has successfully mobilized indigenous communities to resist the encroachment of the oil industry, particularly in the Yasuni National Park, one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. This park, which sits atop vast oil reserves, has been the site of fierce protests by indigenous groups, environmentalists, and human rights advocates who argue that oil drilling would destroy the delicate ecosystem and violate the rights of indigenous peoples who live there. In Peru, indigenous communities have fought for years against the Mina Conga project, a massive gold mining operation in the Cajamarca region. The project, which was proposed by a large multinational corporation, will have caused significant environmental damage to the surrounding area, including the contamination of water sources vital to indigenous communities. Indigenous leaders, such as Gregorio Santos, have led large-scale protests, highlighting the need for sustainable development practices and the preservation of the environment. These movements have garnered global attention as activists and organizations rally in support of indigenous rights and the protection of the Andes' fragile ecosystems. Indigenous leadership in environmental advocacy has not only been effective in resisting destructive projects, but has also highlighted the importance of indigenous knowledge in global efforts to address climate change. Indigenous leaders in the Andes and Amazon have emphasized the role of traditional knowledge in protecting biodiversity, mitigating climate change, and ensuring the sustainability of local ecosystems. They argue that their ancestors' practices of living in harmony with nature can provide valuable lessons for the modern world, where unsustainable development has led to widespread environmental degradation. These movements have been successful in raising awareness on the international stage and have pressured governments to adopt more sustainable policies. However, challenges remain. The pressure from multinational corporations, the influence of state-backed development agendas, and the ongoing struggles for land rights mean that indigenous communities in the Andes continue to face significant obstacles in their fight for environmental justice. In addition to environmental advocacy, another major aspect of the ongoing indigenous struggle in the Andes is the fight for political empowerment and representation. While indigenous peoples played a critical role in the wars of independence, they were largely excluded from the political process in the newly formed nations of South America. In many countries, indigenous peoples were denied political rights, and their cultures were marginalized in favor of European-descended elites. Over the past several decades, however, indigenous peoples in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and other Andean countries have fought for greater political representation and the recognition of their rights within national governance systems. One of the key milestones in this struggle was the election of Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia in 2006. Morales' presidency represented a historic victory for indigenous rights in South America, as he sought to dismantle the colonial structures of power and promote a more inclusive political system that recognized the importance of indigenous cultures and knowledge. In Peru, the fight for political representation has been slower, but there have been significant strides made in recent years. The National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Peoples of Peru, ONPIAP, and other indigenous organizations have pushed for the inclusion of indigenous representatives in national politics. Indigenous leaders have advocated for the creation of policies that address the unique needs of their communities, including land rights, education, and healthcare, while also challenging the dominance of multinational corporations and foreign interests in the region. In 2021, Pedro Castillo, a teacher and trade union leader from the rural highlands, was elected president of Peru. His rise to power was seen as a victory for marginalized rural and indigenous communities who had long felt disconnected from the political process. Castillo's presidency, although facing significant political challenges, has provided a platform for advocating for indigenous issues and bringing attention to the needs of rural communities in the Andes. In both Bolivia and Peru, the push for indigenous political empowerment is part of a broader movement toward a more inclusive, democratic society. Indigenous movements continue to demand that their voices be heard and that their needs be addressed in national policy. While the fight for political power is far from over, the progress made in recent decades demonstrates the growing strength and influence of indigenous peoples in the Andes. The continuing struggle for indigenous rights in the Andes is deeply intertwined with the issue of land and resource sovereignty. For centuries, indigenous communities have fought to reclaim their ancestral lands from the state and multinational corporations that have long exploited them. These lands, which were once part of the vast Inca Empire, are not just valuable in terms of their resources, but are also sacred and integral to the cultural and spiritual identity of indigenous peoples. In the Andes, these territories are home to a variety of ecosystems, including forests, highland grasslands, and mountain ranges that are essential to the survival of indigenous peoples and biodiversity alike. One of the core issues indigenous communities face is the invasion of their land by large corporations involved in mining, agriculture, and hydroelectric projects. These industries, which often receive strong backing from national governments, have been responsible for significant environmental degradation, including deforestation, water contamination, and loss of biodiversity. While these industries promise economic development, they have often resulted in the displacement of indigenous populations and the destruction of ecosystems that are vital for their survival. The expansion of these industries has led to growing tensions between indigenous communities and state-backed corporations, resulting in protests, blockades, and sometimes violent clashes. In countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, indigenous leaders have long advocated for the recognition of their territorial rights and the protection of their land from external exploitation. In Peru, for example, indigenous movements have fought to prevent the construction of large-scale infrastructure projects like dams and highways, which would destroy their lands and disrupt their way of life. These struggles have become increasingly important as the global demand for natural resources, particularly minerals and oil, continues to grow. The fight for indigenous land rights is further complicated by the legacy of colonial land dispossession. During the colonial period, the Spanish crown granted vast territories to European settlers, and much of the indigenous land was taken without compensation. After independence, this pattern continued, with the state often seizing land from indigenous communities to facilitate economic development, including the expansion of large estates for agriculture and mining. These historical injustices have created a complex landscape of land ownership and resource rights that indigenous communities continue to contest. Indigenous movements have made some progress in recent decades, as both national and international legal frameworks have begun to recognize their rights. In 1993, the Peruvian Constitution was amended to recognize the country's indigenous peoples and their right to land. Similarly, international agreements like UNDRIP have provided a legal basis for indigenous struggles, emphasizing the right to self-determination, land, and resources. However, the enforcement of these rights remains inconsistent, and indigenous communities continue to face significant obstacles in their quest for land restitution. The environmental destruction caused by industrialization and resource extraction in the Andes is a critical issue for indigenous communities who have lived in harmony with the land for centuries. The Andean region is home to unique ecosystems that are both culturally and ecologically important. For indigenous peoples, these ecosystems are not just sources of livelihood, but also form an integral part of their cosmology and spirituality. The fight to protect these lands is, therefore, about more than just physical resources. It's about preserving a way of life and the cultural heritage of generations. Indigenous communities in the Andes have a long history of environmental stewardship. Their knowledge of sustainable land use, such as agricultural terraces, irrigation systems, and agroforestry practices, has allowed them to thrive in the high-altitude environments of the Andean mountains. These methods are not only environmentally sustainable, but have also allowed indigenous peoples to adapt to the challenges of living in one of the most ecologically diverse regions of the world. In recent years, the global community has increasingly recognized the importance of indigenous knowledge in the fight against climate change and environmental degradation. Traditional ecological knowledge, TK, which has been passed down through generations, is being integrated into modern environmental science and conservation practices. Indigenous peoples' intimate understanding of local ecosystems, weather patterns, and biodiversity has made them essential partners in conservation efforts. In the Andes, this knowledge is being used to promote sustainable agricultural practices, protect endangered species, and restore degraded ecosystems. One notable example of the incorporation of indigenous knowledge into environmental science is the Quechua community's efforts to protect the Parque Nacional de Huascarán, a UNESCO World Heritage Site located in the Peruvian Andes. This park is home to rare plant and animal species, including the Andean condor, and is an important site for both indigenous communities and conservationists. Indigenous leaders, working with local and international organizations, have played a key role in advocating for the protection of this ecosystem, while also promoting the use of traditional ecological practices, such as rotational grazing and agroforestry, to sustain both the land and the community. In addition to environmental conservation, indigenous communities in the Andes have been at the forefront of the fight for climate justice. As the impacts of climate change become increasingly apparent, indigenous peoples are bearing the brunt of its effects, from rising temperatures to the destruction of glaciers that have been a vital source of water for millennia. Indigenous leaders in the Andes have called for global recognition of the disproportionate impact of climate change on their communities and the need for equitable solutions that respect their rights and knowledge. The connection between indigenous peoples and their land is deeply spiritual, and for many indigenous communities, environmental justice is a matter of cultural survival. The Quechua, Aymara, and other Andean peoples view the land as sacred, and the ongoing exploitation of their territories is seen not only as an economic injustice, but also as a violation of their spiritual and cultural beliefs. As such, the struggle for environmental justice is inextricably linked to the broader movement for indigenous sovereignty and cultural revitalization. The political mobilization of indigenous peoples in the Andes has been a critical factor in their fight for rights and recognition. Over the past few decades, indigenous movements have gained increasing visibility and political influence, both within their own countries and on the international stage. As indigenous peoples continue to challenge centuries of marginalization, their political leadership has become more assertive, with a growing number of indigenous leaders being elected to national offices and participating in global political forums. In Bolivia, the election of Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of the country, marked a historic moment for indigenous peoples across South America. Morales, a member of the Aymara ethnic group, ran on a platform of indigenous rights, environmental protection, and social justice. His election was seen as a victory for the indigenous population, who had long been excluded from political power. Under Morales' leadership, Bolivia enacted significant reforms, including the rewriting of the Constitution to recognize the country's indigenous heritage and ensure the protection of indigenous rights. In Peru, the rise of indigenous political movements has been slower, but significant progress has been made in recent years. Indigenous leaders and organizations have increasingly participated in national politics, advocating for the recognition of indigenous rights, land reforms, and the protection of cultural heritage. The election of Pedro Castillo as president of Peru in 2021, a former schoolteacher from the rural highlands, was seen as a turning point for indigenous political representation. Castillo's victory reflected the growing dissatisfaction of rural, indigenous communities with the political elite and their demands for a government that would address their needs. Indigenous political mobilization has not been without its challenges. However, many indigenous leaders continue to face political repression, violence, and intimidation from both state authorities and private interests. Despite these obstacles, indigenous movements have become a powerful force in shaping the political landscape of the Andes. Their calls for land restitution, environmental protection, and cultural revitalization have gained traction both nationally and internationally, and their leadership is increasingly seen as essential in the struggle for a more equitable and sustainable future. In the global context, indigenous leaders from the Andes have participated in international forums such as the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, where they have called for greater recognition of indigenous rights, climate justice, and sustainable development. These leaders are helping to shape global discussions on issues such as biodiversity, human rights, and social justice, ensuring that indigenous voices are heard and their contributions recognized in the global conversation. As the global focus on environmental sustainability, human rights, and climate change has increased, the struggles of indigenous communities in the Andes have become more visible. Indigenous rights are no longer confined to regional debates, but have become central issues on the global stage. In the context of global development, indigenous movements in the Andes are pushing for a shift in how development is conceptualized and implemented. For indigenous peoples, development has long been equated with a loss of land, culture, and autonomy. Traditional models of development, often driven by multinational corporations and state-backed projects, have prioritized economic growth and resource extraction over the well-being of indigenous communities and the preservation of their cultural heritage. A critical point in this conversation is the concept of development with dignity, a framework advocated by indigenous leaders and organizations in the Andes. This framework emphasizes the need for development models that are rooted in the needs, aspirations, and traditions of indigenous peoples. Rather than focusing solely on economic growth and infrastructure, this model calls for a holistic approach to development that respects indigenous land rights, protects natural resources, and promotes cultural revitalization. Indigenous leaders argue that development must be inclusive and based on sustainability, rather than exploitative practices that damage ecosystems and disenfranchise local populations. One key example of indigenous resistance to traditional development projects is the opposition to large-scale hydroelectric dams in the Andes. In countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, indigenous communities have led campaigns against dam projects that threaten their rivers, forests, and way of life. These projects often promise significant economic benefits, such as increased electricity production and job creation, but they have devastating environmental and social consequences. Dams flood vast areas of land, displacing indigenous populations, destroying habitats, and disrupting traditional livelihoods, such as fishing and agriculture. Indigenous groups have challenged these projects through protests, legal actions, and direct engagement with international environmental organizations. One prominent example is the case of the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil, which was met with significant opposition from the indigenous peoples of the Amazon. While this dam project is not located in the Andes, it has broader implications for indigenous rights in South America. It has become a symbol of the resistance of indigenous peoples to the imposition of development projects that disregard their environmental and cultural rights. These efforts have not only raised awareness about the environmental impact of large infrastructure projects, but have also sparked discussions about the need for alternative development models that prioritize the needs and values of indigenous communities. The recognition of indigenous rights in the context of global development is increasingly evident in international agreements. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which were adopted in 2015, include provisions for indigenous peoples' rights to land, culture, and resources. These goals highlight the need for inclusive development that does not exclude indigenous peoples from the benefits of development. While challenges remain in translating these goals into concrete actions, the growing alignment between global sustainability efforts and indigenous rights offers hope for a future where indigenous voices are integral to the planning and execution of development projects. The ongoing indigenous rights movements in the Andes are not only about land, resources, and cultural preservation. They are also about gender equality and social justice. Indigenous women in the Andes have long been at the forefront of these struggles, fighting not only for the rights of their communities, but also for the recognition of their roles within their societies. In traditional Andean cultures, women have often held significant roles in agriculture, family life, and community leadership. Despite this, they have also been subjected to patriarchal systems that limit their access to political power, economic resources, and decision-making processes. The machismo culture that has pervaded many Andean societies, both under Spanish colonialism and in post-colonial times, has marginalized indigenous women, denying them equal access to land, education, healthcare, and political representation. However, in recent decades, indigenous women in the Andes have begun to organize and demand greater recognition and empowerment. These women are challenging both colonial legacies and internal cultural practices that limit their freedom and rights. Their movements are multifaceted, focusing on social justice, political representation, environmental sustainability, and economic equality. One of the most prominent examples of indigenous women's leadership is the Confederación Nacional Agraria, CNA. In Peru, an organization that advocates for the rights of peasant and indigenous women in rural areas. The CNA works to secure land rights for women, promote their participation in local governance, and fight against domestic violence. Their work extends beyond the Andes, as they have been involved in regional and global discussions on indigenous women's rights, particularly in relation to land, labor, and natural resource management. Indigenous women have also been at the forefront of environmental movements in the Andes. As the custodians of traditional agricultural practices, indigenous women have a unique knowledge of sustainable farming and water management systems. They are increasingly seen as vital partners in efforts to combat climate change and preserve the environment. Indigenous women's organizations are now actively engaging with international forums like the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP, to advocate for policies that address the specific needs of women in the context of environmental justice and climate resilience. Their involvement is critical because Indigenous women are often disproportionately affected by environmental degradation, including deforestation, mining, and the contamination of water sources. They bear the brunt of climate change, especially in rural areas where agriculture is their primary means of livelihood. Moreover, they are often the primary caregivers in their communities, responsible for the health, education, and well-being of their families. The challenges they face are compounded by gender inequality, and their struggles are central to the broader fight for Indigenous rights. As we look to the future of Indigenous rights in the Andes, the path forward is both challenging and promising. The struggles of Indigenous peoples to secure land rights, cultural preservation, and political empowerment are far from over. Despite the progress made over the past few decades, Indigenous communities continue to face systemic barriers that hinder their ability to fully participate in political, economic, and social life. These barriers include ongoing land dispossession, environmental degradation, discrimination, and the exclusion of Indigenous voices from mainstream decision-making processes. However, the resilience of Indigenous movements and the increasing recognition of their rights on the global stage offer hope for a more just and equitable future. Indigenous leaders in the Andes continue to push for the recognition of their right to self-determination, which includes the freedom to make decisions about their lands, resources, and cultural practices without external interference. This right is enshrined in international law, including UNDRIP, but it remains a work in progress in many countries, where Indigenous peoples still lack full control over their territories and natural resources. One of the key challenges moving forward will be the implementation of legal frameworks that protect Indigenous rights. While many countries in South America have signed international agreements recognizing Indigenous rights, the enforcement of these rights remains inconsistent. Governments often fail to fully respect Indigenous sovereignty when it conflicts with economic interests, such as mining or oil extraction. The role of international organizations, environmental groups, and human rights advocates will continue to be crucial in holding governments accountable and ensuring that Indigenous rights are upheld. Another critical issue is the increasing intersectionality of Indigenous struggles. Indigenous peoples are not only fighting for land and resource rights, but are also addressing issues of racial, gender, and social justice. As Indigenous women, youth, and elders take more active roles in leadership, their voices will be essential in shaping the future of Indigenous rights. The rise of Indigenous youth movements in the Andes, as seen with organizations like Yunga Inti in Peru and Inca Youth Movement in Bolivia, signifies a new generation of activists dedicated to advocating for their communities and preserving their cultural heritage. The future of Indigenous rights in the Andes also depends on the ability of Indigenous communities to navigate the global political landscape while maintaining their cultural identity. As globalization accelerates and new economic and political realities emerge, Indigenous peoples must find ways to assert their rights without compromising their traditional ways of life. The continued focus on environmental justice, cultural revitalization, and political representation will be central to ensuring that Indigenous communities can thrive in the 21st century. One of the most significant aspects of the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights in the Andes has been the role of the legal system in defending those rights. Over the years, several landmark legal cases have highlighted the tension between Indigenous communities and the state, particularly regarding land rights, resource extraction, and territorial sovereignty. These cases have often served as critical turning points, setting precedents for the protection of Indigenous peoples' rights, both within their countries and on the international stage. A notable example of such a case is the Caso del Pueblo Indigena in Ecuador, where the Quechua people of the Cococoto-Sinclair region took legal action to stop the construction of a hydroelectric dam that would have flooded their ancestral lands. The Quechua, supported by local environmental and human rights organizations, argued that the project violated their right to free, prior, and informed consent, a principle established under international law, particularly through International Labor Organization, ILO, Convention number 169. This case, along with others in Ecuador, highlighted the importance of prior consultation before any development project is undertaken on indigenous lands. In the case of Peru, indigenous communities have also sought legal redress for land dispossession and the ongoing environmental degradation caused by mining and logging operations. One of the most prominent cases in recent history is the Quilca case, involving the indigenous Quechua and Aymara peoples in the southern highlands of Peru. These communities have fought for the right to reclaim lands that were illegally appropriated by both colonial powers and post-independence governments. The government, in many instances, has overlooked indigenous land claims, particularly in rural areas where large-scale mining projects have taken root. In 2006, the Peruvian Constitutional Court ruled in favor of indigenous communities in the Quilca case, affirming that the right to land was integral to the protection of indigenous cultures. This decision marked a significant victory as it recognized the importance of ancestral land to the cultural, spiritual, and economic survival of indigenous peoples. Yet, despite the victory, the enforcement of this ruling has been slow, and indigenous communities still face difficulties in securing the return of their lands due to ongoing legal and bureaucratic barriers. Another landmark case, which gained international attention, was the Saramacca people versus Suriname case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, ICHR. This case, though not based in the Andes, had significant implications for indigenous rights across the region. In this case, the Saramacca people of Suriname successfully argued that their right to land and territory was being violated by logging companies and the government. The court ruled that the Saramacca people must be consulted before any natural resource extraction occurs on their lands, setting an important precedent for similar cases in the Andes and beyond. It demonstrated the growing international recognition of the right to prior consultation and reinforced the idea that development projects cannot proceed without indigenous consent. The results of these legal cases have been mixed. While some communities have won significant victories, the enforcement of legal rulings remains a persistent challenge. Governments often show reluctance to prioritize indigenous rights over national development agendas, particularly when large-scale industries and foreign investments are at stake. This dynamic has led to legal paralysis in some regions, where indigenous communities win cases in courts but face delays or outright resistance when it comes to the implementation of rulings. The ongoing struggle for indigenous rights in the Andes has been greatly supported by international advocacy, especially by non-governmental organizations, NGOs, dedicated to human rights and environmental justice. These organizations play a critical role in amplifying the voices of indigenous communities and holding governments and corporations accountable for violations of indigenous rights. International organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, IWGI, have been instrumental in documenting human rights abuses, land dispossession, and environmental destruction caused by extractive industries in the Andes. They have provided crucial evidence for legal cases, mobilized international pressure on governments, and helped indigenous communities navigate the complex web of legal and political systems in their fight for justice. One of the key roles that NGOs play is in advocacy and lobbying at international forums such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, ICHR. These platforms provide indigenous communities with the opportunity to present their cases to the international community, raising awareness of the challenges they face and pushing for policy changes. International pressure, particularly in the form of boycotts, sanctions, or public condemnation, has been effective in some instances, forcing governments and multinational corporations to reconsider development projects that harm indigenous peoples and their environments. An important example of this type of advocacy was the campaign surrounding the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil. While this case is located outside the Andes, it has important implications for indigenous rights in South America. NGOs like Amazon Watch and Survival International played an active role in bringing international attention to the plight of the Xingu and other indigenous communities threatened by the dam. Their work resulted in widespread global opposition to the project, forcing the Brazilian government and the private companies involved to reevaluate the scope of the dam and its environmental impact. In Peru, NGOs such as La Coordinadora Nacional de Derechos Humanos, CNDDHH, have helped to protect indigenous rights by providing legal assistance, organizing protests, and advocating for land reforms. Their support has been critical in many legal battles, particularly when communities are facing overwhelming opposition from the state or private corporations. NGOs often help indigenous communities navigate complex legal systems and ensure that their voices are heard in courtrooms, national policy discussions, and international human rights forums. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the increasing recognition of indigenous peoples as leaders in the global environmental movement. As climate change becomes a more urgent global issue, indigenous peoples in the Andes and across the Americas are being recognized for their deep knowledge of sustainable environmental practices and their ability to manage ecosystems in a way that promotes long-term ecological health. Indigenous knowledge systems, passed down through generations, have long emphasized the importance of balance with nature, sustainable land use, and respect for the environment. This recognition has been reflected in the growing participation of indigenous leaders in international climate conferences, such as the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP. Indigenous representatives from the Andes and other regions have increasingly been invited to share their knowledge and experience in forums that were previously dominated by governments and large corporations. This shift is not just symbolic. It represents a growing acknowledgement of the role that indigenous peoples must play in addressing the global climate crisis. At COP21 in 2015, for example, indigenous representatives from the Andes and the Amazon, including the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, CONE, played a key role in advocating for the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in climate policies. Their efforts helped ensure that the Paris Agreement recognized the importance of indigenous peoples' rights and their role in sustainable development. The participation of indigenous leaders in COP conferences has paved the way for further inclusion in climate policy discussions and has given indigenous peoples a platform to demand that their rights be respected in the context of global environmental governance. The global environmental movement has recognized the need to integrate indigenous knowledge into climate change solutions. Indigenous peoples are not only seen as victims of climate change, but also as active agents who can contribute valuable perspectives on how to protect the environment and mitigate the effects of climate change. Indigenous communities in the Andes, with their intimate understanding of ecosystems, have advocated for eco-friendly practices such as agroforestry, rotational grazing, and sustainable water management. These practices have proven effective in preserving biodiversity and mitigating soil erosion, among other environmental benefits. Indigenous-led environmental movements are also pushing for a new economic paradigm, one that prioritizes the health of the environment and the well-being of local communities over unchecked economic growth. These movements are challenging the prevailing economic models that promote exploitation of natural resources for short-term gain, instead advocating for long-term sustainability and equitable distribution of resources. Indigenous leadership in environmental advocacy has been pivotal in the Andes, where the region's fragile ecosystems are facing growing threats from climate change, resource extraction, and deforestation. For centuries, indigenous communities in the Andes have relied on sustainable agricultural practices, deep knowledge of local ecosystems, and traditional methods of resource management that have helped maintain biodiversity and ecosystem services. The participation of indigenous leaders in COP conferences has paved the way for further inclusion in climate policy discussions and has given indigenous peoples a platform to demand that their rights be respected in the context of global environmental governance. The global environmental movement has recognized the need to integrate indigenous knowledge into climate change solutions. Indigenous peoples are not only seen as victims of climate change, but also as active agents who can contribute valuable perspectives on how to protect the environment and mitigate the effects of climate change. Indigenous communities in the Andes, with their intimate understanding of ecosystems, have advocated for eco-friendly practices such as agroforestry, rotational grazing, and sustainable water management. These practices have proven effective in preserving biodiversity and mitigating soil erosion, among other environmental benefits. Indigenous-led environmental movements are also pushing for a new economic paradigm, one that prioritizes the health of the environment and the well-being of local communities over unchecked economic growth. These movements are challenging the prevailing economic models that promote exploitation of natural resources for short-term gain, instead advocating for long-term sustainability and equitable distribution of resources. Indigenous leadership in environmental advocacy has been pivotal in the Andes, where the region's fragile ecosystems are facing growing threats from climate change, resource extraction, and deforestation. For centuries, indigenous communities in the Andes have relied on sustainable agricultural practices, deep knowledge of local ecosystems, and traditional methods of resource management that have helped maintain biodiversity and ecosystem services. So, what did we learn today? From the preservation of ancient knowledge to the fierce defense of their land and rights. Indigenous youth in the Andes are the heartbeat of a movement that will shape the future. Their fight is not just for their own communities. It's a fight for the planet, for justice, and for the very survival of their cultures. The moral of today's story is clear. Resilience, unity, and the power of young voices can bring about significant change. And they're not only fighting for the past, they're fighting for the future. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through history. If you found inspiration in the stories of these young leaders, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to History Teller YT for more riveting histories that continue to shape our world. We'll be back soon with more tales from the past and present, so make sure to stay tuned for our next exploration.